I'd been a park ranger for 3 months when I first found the stone. Fresh out of training and eager to prove myself, I'd jumped at the opportunity when it presented itself. The position had been open for months. Few people wanted to work in such isolation, they said. I should have wondered why. The assignment was a dream come true, managing a remote section of a reservation known for its untouched wilderness and breathtaking views. The territory stretched for miles, dense forest broken only by crystal-clear streams and the occasional rocky outcropping. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches weaving together to create a canopy that filtered the sunlight into ethereal patterns on the forest floor. I was supposed to monitor the trails, keep an eye on wildlife, and report anything unusual. The solitude suited me, or at least I thought it did. It wasn't until my 4th week out that I stumbled upon something truly strange. It was early evening, and the sun was dipping low, painting the landscape in soft oranges and reds. The autumn air carried the crisp scent of pine needles and decaying leaves, and my boots crunched softly against the forest floor. I was mapping a lesser-used trail that cut through a clearing surrounded by towering pines, their bark black with shadow in the fading light. That's when I heard it for the first time. A faint, almost imperceptible hum, like the resonance of a distant tuning fork. I paused, listening intently, my breath visible in the cooling air. The sound was low and steady, more felt than heard, and it seemed to be coming from a small cluster of stones in the clearing. The wind died down, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. At first glance, the stones looked ordinary enough. They were arranged in a rough circle, worn smooth by countless seasons, their surfaces mottled with patches of pale green and gray moss. But as I approached, drawn by an inexplicable pull, the hum grew louder, resonating in my chest like a second heartbeat. One of the stones, larger and smoother than the others, stood at the center. It seemed to shimmer faintly in the fading light, as if covered in a film of oil that caught and refracted the dying sun. My training told me to keep my distance, to document and report without interference. But something about the stone called to me. I knelt down and placed my hand on it, ignoring the voice in the back of my mind that warned against such intimate contact. The surface was cold and slightly damp, but beneath that initial sensation, there was a strange vibration, almost like the stone was alive, like pressing your hand against the chest of a sleeping giant and feeling its slow, steady breathing. I felt a pang of unease, but brushed it off as imagination, the product of too many solitary hours in the wilderness. After all, rocks don't hum, or so I thought. When I returned to the station that evening, my mind still buzzing with questions. The small outpost felt particularly lonely that night, its wooden walls seeming to absorb the darkness that pressed against the windows. My report was brief, mentioning the humming stone and its peculiar vibration. I kept the more unsettling details to myself, the way the air had felt charged around the stones, how the silence had seemed to deepen unnaturally. I didn't expect much to come of it, but the sound stayed with me, echoing in the quiet moments between thoughts. Even after I got home to my cabin, I could still hear it faintly in the back of my mind, like a half-remembered melody that wouldn't fade. Over the next few days, I found excuses to revisit the clearing. Each time the hum was there, soft but constant, growing slightly stronger with each visit. Or perhaps I was just becoming more attuned to it. I tried recording it on various devices, my phone, a digital recorder, even an old tape recorder I found in the station's storage room. But nothing picked up on my equipment. The recordings were filled with only forest sounds, wind through branches, distant bird calls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. My curiosity grew, and I started to wonder if it could be some kind of natural phenomenon. An underground spring, maybe, or shifting tectonic plates. I spent hours researching similar occurrences, but found nothing that quite matched what I was experiencing. Then, on a whim, or perhaps guided by something darker, I broke a rule. I took a small stone from the edge of the circle. It wasn't part of the main cluster, just a loose fragment that seemed insignificant, barely larger than my palm. Its surface was rough on one side and oddly smooth on the other, with a faint spiral pattern that caught the light. I pocketed it, telling myself I could analyze it later or show it to a geologist friend. The moment the stone left its place, the hum changed pitch ever so slightly, but I convinced myself it was just the wind. That's when things began to change. That night, I couldn't sleep. The hum was louder now, almost intrusive, taking on a quality that made my teeth ache. It seemed to follow me through the cabin, resonating in the walls and vibrating through my bed frame. The wooden floors creaked with unfamiliar patterns, and shadows in the corners seemed deeper than usual. I tossed and turned, trying to block it out with a pillow over my head, but it was no use. The sound had become internal somehow, buzzing behind my eyes. Around 3 a.m., driven by a mixture of exhaustion and desperation, I got up and fished the stone out of my jacket pocket. It felt warm, almost feverishly so, and the hum seemed to emanate directly from it, pulsing in time with my racing heart. I set it on the kitchen table and stepped back, staring at it like it was some kind of alien artifact. The moonlight streaming through the window cast strange shadows around it, shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. What the hell had I brought home? By morning, I was convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. The stone sat innocently on my table, looking perfectly ordinary in the harsh light of day. Sleep deprivation and isolation can do strange things to the mind. I'd been warned about that during training. I decided to return the stone to the clearing, hoping that would put an end to whatever was happening. The drive to the trailhead felt longer than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the tree line. But when I arrived, the clearing felt different. The air was heavier, almost syrupy, and the hum was louder than ever, reverberating through the trees like the drone of some massive underground machinery. The birds were silent, and even the insects seemed to have abandoned the area. As I approached the circle, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Blackened patches of grass around the stones, like scorch marks radiating outward from the center. My heart sank as I realized what I'd done. With trembling hands, I placed the stone back where I'd found it and turned to leave. That's when I saw the figures. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden among the trees, stood 3 shadowy forms. They were tall and indistinct, their features obscured by what looked like constantly shifting darkness. But their presence was undeniable. The hum seemed to emanate from them as much as from the stones, creating a discordant harmony that made my vision blur. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, fingers digging into my palms hard enough to leave marks. They didn't move, didn't make a sound beyond that terrible humming. They just stood there, watching with what I somehow knew were hollow, ancient eyes. The air between us seemed to thicken and distort, like heat waves rising from hot pavement, but the temperature had dropped dramatically. My breath came out in visible puffs, though it was barely autumn. The figures remained motionless, but the shadows around them writhed and twisted, reaching out like tendrils before retreating back into their dark forms. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep my balance. As I retreated, the hum grew louder, almost deafening, taking on a quality that reminded me of distant, discordant singing. I stumbled over a root and nearly fell, my heart threatening to burst from my chest, but I didn't dare take my eyes off the figures. The trees around them seemed to bend inward, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. By the time I reached the trailhead, they were gone, though the forest behind me still resonated with that terrible sound. Back at the station, I sat in my truck for what felt like hours, trying to steady my breathing and make sense of what I'd seen. I debated whether to report what I'd seen. Who would believe me? Shadowy figures in the woods, a humming stone. It sounded ridiculous, like something from a bad campfire story. The official report would require drug testing, psychological evaluation. They might even suspend me. Instead, I decided to keep my distance from the clearing and focus on other areas of the park, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was just a trick of the light, a product of stress and isolation. But the hum didn't let me go. Over the next few weeks, the sound followed me everywhere, weaving itself into the fabric of my daily life. It was in the rustling of leaves, the murmur of streams, the creak of my cabin walls at night. The natural sounds of the forest began to feel wrong, distorted, as if everything was slightly out of tune. I started dreaming about the clearing, about the stones and the figures. In the dreams, they spoke to me, though their words were garbled and fragmented, like trying to understand a conversation underwater. One phrase stood out, repeated over and over in a voice that seemed to scrape against the inside of my skull. Return what was taken. My sleep became increasingly disturbed. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find myself standing at my window, staring out into the darkness. Sometimes I thought I saw movement among the trees, tall shapes that disappeared when I looked directly at them. The shadows in my cabin grew longer, deeper, and seemed to pulse in time with the endless humming. One night, I woke to find my sheets damp with sweat and the stone back on my kitchen table. I was sure I'd left it in the clearing. I remembered placing it there, remembered the way the grass had blackened around it. But there it was, humming softly in the moonlight that filtered through my window. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the surface warm and alive against my skin. The vibration was stronger than ever, and for a moment, I thought I felt a heartbeat within it, out of sync with my own. I knew then that I couldn't ignore this any longer. Desperate for answers, I visited an elder in the nearby village, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel of my truck. The reservation's small collection of houses seemed unnaturally quiet that afternoon, as if the very air was holding its breath. His name was Thomas, and he'd lived on the reservation his whole life, his weathered face a map of decades spent in these ancient forests. When I described the stone in the clearing, his face darkened, deep lines etching themselves around his mouth and eyes. "You should never have touched it," he said gravely, his voice carrying the weight of generations. His small living room was filled with traditional crafts and old photographs, but my eyes were drawn to a peculiar mark carved into his doorframe. A spiral, similar to the one I'd seen on the stone. Those stones are sacred. They're a seal. "A seal?" I repeated, my mouth dry as paper. The words seemed to hang in the air between us, heavy with meaning. Thomas nodded slowly, his dark eyes fixed on something distant. "Long ago, before my grandfather's grandfather, A spirit of great sorrow and anger was bound to that place. The stones keep it contained, placed there by our ancestors who understood things we've forgotten. To disturb them is to risk unleashing it. He paused, running his fingers over a string of worn prayer beads. The seal was created during a time of great darkness, when the spirit's grief threatened to consume everything. It took 7 medicine men to bind it. I told him about the figures, the hum, and the stone's strange behavior, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. He listened quietly, occasionally nodding as if confirming something he already knew. The shadows in his home seemed to deepen as I spoke, and I could have sworn I heard a faint humming coming from the walls. "You've weakened the seal," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The spirit is reaching out to you, trying to escape. Its sorrow calls to the sorrow in all living things. If it breaks free..." He shook his head. "You must restore what you've taken and perform a cleansing ritual. Quickly." He gave me a list of items: sage that had been dried in the full moon's light, sweetgrass gathered at dawn, a ceremonial drum made from cedar wood and elk hide. As he wrote, his hand trembled slightly, and I noticed dark circles under his eyes, as if he too had been losing sleep. He also warned me to act quickly, his voice taking on an urgency that made my skin crawl. The longer the seal is broken, the stronger the spirit becomes. If it escapes fully... He didn't finish the sentence, but the silence that followed spoke volumes. The next day dawned gray and cold, the sun a pale disk behind clouds that seemed too dark for the season. I returned to the clearing with the items Thomas had given me, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air was thick and oppressive, like trying to breathe underwater, and the hum was almost unbearable, vibrating in my bones and making my teeth ache. The blackened grass had spread in a spiral pattern from the stone circle, and the stones themselves seemed to pulse faintly with an inner light, as if something beneath them was trying to break through. The trees around the clearing had changed. Their bark was darker, almost black, and their branches seemed to reach toward the center of the stone circle like grasping fingers. No birds sang. No insects chirped. The forest was holding its breath, waiting. My hands shook as I lit the sage and sweetgrass, the smoke curling up in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural. The drum's steady beat echoed through the clearing as I began to play it, following the rhythm Thomas had taught me. Each beat seemed to push back against the humming, creating a counterpoint that grounded me as I recited the words he had passed down, ancient syllables that felt both foreign and familiar on my tongue. The hum began to waver, its tone shifting like a scream underwater, rising and falling in pitch until it seemed to fill the entire clearing with discordant sound. The smoke thickened, taking on shapes that made my eyes hurt to look at, curling around the stones and rising up like a barrier against the encroaching darkness. The figures appeared again, closer than ever before. Their forms were more defined now, and I could see suggestions of features in their shadowy faces. Hollow eyes that reflected no light, mouths that opened too wide and contained only darkness. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, as if they were part of the shadows themselves. "Return what was taken," one of them said, its voice low and resonant, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words echoed in my head, each repetition carrying centuries of grief and rage. My hands were numb with cold as I placed the stone in the center of the circle, pressing it firmly into the earth. The moment it touched the ground, the hum rose to a deafening crescendo, a sound that contained within it the voices of countless lost souls. The figures began to dissipate, their forms breaking apart like smoke in the wind. but not before I caught a glimpse of their true faces, ancient, sorrowful things that no human was meant to see. The smoke from the sage and sweetgrass swirled faster, forming a vortex around the stones. For a moment, I thought I saw other figures in the smoke. People in traditional dress, their hands raised in ceremony, their voices joining with mine in songs I somehow knew, but had never learned. Then everything went silent, and the clearing fell still. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling and drenched in sweat despite the cold. When I finally managed to stand on shaking legs, the clearing felt different. The air was lighter, and the oppressive weight that had hung over everything was gone. The stones were still, their surfaces dull and lifeless in the weak sunlight that now filtered through the trees. The blackened grass had begun to fade, new growth already pushing through the scorched earth. Thomas told me later that the ritual had worked, but he warned me never to return to the clearing. His eyes were serious as he pressed a small medicine bag into my hands. The seal is strong again, but it's best not to tempt fate. Some boundaries were meant to remain unbroken. The hum has disappeared from my life, but I still dream about the stones sometimes. In the dreams, the figures watch from the shadows, silent and unmoving, their hollow eyes holding centuries of pain. I've come to accept that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some lines should never be crossed. The medicine bag hangs by my bed now, and on quiet nights, I think I can hear it softly humming, not the discordant sound of the stones, but a gentler melody, a reminder of protection and balance. The forest keeps its secrets, and I'll never forget the lesson it taught me. Some things are better left undisturbed. There are older things in this world than we can comprehend. Ancient sorrows and sacred boundaries that demand respect. I still work as a ranger, but I've learned to listen differently now, not just to the sounds of the forest, but to the spaces between those sounds, to the wisdom carried in silence, and to the boundaries that keep our world safe from things we were never meant to understand. The land was a gift, or so I thought. When my grandfather passed away, he left me 80 acres of farmland just outside the reservation's border. It had been in the family for generations, though no one had worked it in years. The old farmhouse was still standing, barely, its weathered clapboards peeling like dead skin, windows clouded with decades of dust and neglect. The field stretched out beyond it like a sea of forgotten dreams, overrun with weeds and wildflowers that danced in the prairie wind. I wasn't much of a farmer, but times were tough. My wife, Sarah, and I had just welcomed our second child, little Emma, whose cries echoed through the drafty halls of our small city apartment. Our firstborn, Michael, was barely 3, and the mounting bills felt like they were suffocating us slowly. The idea of cultivating the land seemed like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. I spent weeks clearing the fields, starting with the old cornfield at the edge of the property. The work was backbreaking, but there was something satisfying about watching the wilderness slowly give way to ordered rows. That's when the warnings began. "You shouldn't touch that field," one of the elders from the nearby village said when I stopped by their general store for supplies. The bell above the door had chimed discordantly as I entered, and the smell of sage and sweet grass hung heavy in the air. "It's sacred land." "Sacred?" I asked, confused, setting down the bag of seed I'd been examining. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps. "It's just an overgrown cornfield." The elder, a wiry man with sharp eyes named Tom Greyfeather, shook his head. His long silver hair was tied back with a leather cord, and deep lines etched his copper-colored face like dry riverbeds. "It's a boundary. Offerings were made there to keep the balance between our world and theirs. Leave it be. His weathered hands gripped the counter's edge, knuckles white with tension. I thanked him politely but didn't take it seriously. The weight of my children's future pressed too heavily on my shoulders. Sacred or not, we needed that field to make ends meet. I left the store with my supplies, the bell's discordant note following me out into the afternoon sun. The first sign that something was wrong came after I started plowing. The tractor, a John Deere that had cost nearly all our savings, sputtered and stalled as I worked, though it was brand new. The engine would die without warning, leaving me stranded in the middle of the field as shadows lengthened around me. At first, I thought it was just bad luck, a lemon from the dealership. Then I noticed the crows. Hundreds of them perched along the fence line, their obsidian feathers gleaming in the sunlight, watching me in eerie silence. Their eyes followed my every movement, like tiny black beads of judgment. "Sarah, have you ever seen so many birds?" I asked that evening as we stood on the creaking porch, looking out at the field. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of blood and bruise, casting long shadows across the freshly turned earth. She frowned, clutching Emma closer to her chest. The baby was unusually quiet, her tiny face turned toward the field. "They've been there all day. It's unsettling." A cool breeze carried the scent of upturned soil and something else, something ancient and musty, like the air from a freshly opened tomb. Unsettling didn't begin to cover it. By the time night fell, the crows were gone, but the silence lingered. The usual chirping of crickets and distant hoots of owls were absent, replaced by a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to press against our eardrums like cotton wool. Even the wind died, leaving the air stagnant and thick. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was Sarah talking in her sleep. She'd been having nightmares lately, though she wouldn't tell me about what. But when I turned over, she was out cold, her face peaceful in the pale moonlight that filtered through our bedroom window. The whispers were faint but persistent, drifting in from the direction of the cornfield like dead leaves on an autumn breeze. They seemed to carry words just beyond my understanding, like a language I'd known in childhood, but forgotten. I got out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floors. The flashlight felt heavy in my hand as I made my way downstairs, each step causing the old house to creak and groan in protest. As I passed the children's room, I heard Michael whimper in his sleep, his small body curled tight beneath his dinosaur blanket. The night air hit me like a wall when I stepped outside. It was thick with fog, the kind that seems to have substance, that clings to your skin like spider webs. The beam of my flashlight barely penetrated it, creating a small tunnel of visibility in the ghostly white soup. As I approached the field, the whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They spoke in that almost familiar tongue, their words carrying an urgency that made my heart race. I stopped at the edge of the field, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The corn stalks swayed gently, though there was no wind. Not even a breath of air stirred the fog. The movement was wrong, somehow organic, as if the plants themselves were breathing. Then I saw them, shadows moving among the rows. They were tall and thin, their shapes human but wrong, as if their limbs were stretched too far, like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Their movements were fluid but unnatural, joints bending in ways that made my mind recoil. I froze, unable to breathe, as one of the shadows turned toward me. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dead fire, and in their depths, I saw something that made my soul shrivel. I ran back to the house, my feet barely touching the ground, slamming the door behind me with enough force to rattle the windows. Sarah found me sitting at the kitchen table, pale and shaking, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I didn't remember making. "What's wrong?" she asked, alarmed. The overhead light cast harsh shadows on her face, making her look older, worn. I heard the door. I couldn't find the words to explain what I'd seen. How do you tell your wife that the darkness itself had turned to look at you? That you'd seen something that shouldn't exist in any sane world? I think the field is cursed. I managed finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a bad dream, a product of stress and an overactive imagination. The sun was bright, and the fog had burned away, leaving the world looking normal, almost defiantly so. I went back to the field, determined to finish what I'd started. The mortgage wouldn't pay itself, and dreams couldn't hurt us in the daylight. At least that's what I told myself. But as soon as I stepped onto the soil, I felt it, a deep, thrumming sensation beneath my feet, like the heartbeat of something massive and ancient. It pulsed through the earth, up through my boots, and into my bones. Each step felt like I was walking on something alive, something that was aware of my presence. I pressed on, ignoring the unease that made my skin crawl. By the time I finished plowing, the soil was dark and rich, ready for planting. The surface looked normal enough, but there was something about its color that bothered me. It was too black, too absolute, as if it was absorbing more light than it should. I told myself the whispers and shadows were just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. The land was trying to tell me something, and I was deliberately turning a deaf ear. That night, the dreams began. I was standing in the middle of the cornfield, surrounded by towering stalks that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, their leaves razor sharp and gleaming in a light that had no source. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay and something else, a sweet cloying scent that reminded me of funeral flowers. The shadows were there, circling me, their hollow eyes glowing brighter with each pass. They moved in perfect synchronization, like dancers in a macabre ballet. One of them stepped forward, its elongated hand reaching for me, fingers like black twigs against the darkness. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around me like burial shrouds. Sarah was awake too, holding our youngest, who wouldn't stop crying. Emma's wails had a desperate quality to them, as if she was seeing something that terrified her. "The kids have been restless all night," Sarah said, dark circles under her eyes, testament to many such nights. "It's like they can sense something." She didn't meet my gaze as she spoke, and I wondered what she saw when she looked out at the field. What mothers know that fathers are too blind to see. I didn't tell her about the dream. How could I, when she was already carrying so much? The sleepless nights with the children, the stress of the move, the isolation of rural life. She didn't need my nightmares added to her burden. But my silence created a wall between us, as real as the shadows in the field. The days blurred together in a haze of increasing wrongness. Every night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, the shadows more vivid and bold. They no longer waited for darkness, sometimes visible at the corner of my eye, even in bright daylight. During the day, I noticed other strange occurrences, tools disappearing only to reappear in impossible places, animals giving the field a wide berth as if repelled by an invisible barrier. The air grew colder the closer I got to the cornfield, until working there felt like standing in a walk-in freezer. Sarah started asking questions about the bruise-like circles under my eyes, the way I jumped at small sounds, but I brushed her off, insisting everything was fine. The lie tasted like ashes in my mouth. Then, one evening, our dog Max went missing. He was a good dog, a gentle giant of a German shepherd who'd been with us since before the kids. We searched the property, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. The beam of our flashlights cut through the gathering darkness, but there was no answering bark, no familiar thump of his tail against the ground. It wasn't until dawn that we found him, lying at the edge of the cornfield like a broken toy. His body was twisted, as if something had broken every bone, rearranged him like a child's puzzle put together wrong. His eyes were open, staring at something we couldn't see, and his mouth was frozen in a rictus of terror. I went back to the village, desperate for answers. The general store seemed different now, older somehow, the fluorescent lights dimmer, the shadows in the corners deeper. Tom Greyfeather listened as I recounted everything, the whispers that had become a nightly chorus, the shadows that danced at the edge of vision, the dreams that felt more real than waking. "You were warned," he said, his tone heavy with regret. The lines in his face seemed deeper now, his eyes darker. "The field isn't just a boundary. It's a door, and now you've opened it." He moved behind the counter with the careful deliberation of age, though I remembered him being sprier just weeks ago. "How do I close it?" I asked, my voice shaking. The bell above the door chimed without moving, and the smell of sage was overwhelming. "You can't," he said, and in those two words, I heard the death of hope. "But you can appease them." He handed me a small pouch filled with herbs, sage, sweetgrass, and others I couldn't identify, and a wooden bowl carved with symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Offer this at the center of the field. Light the herbs and speak their name, Tehisha. It means shadow walkers, but be warned, they will demand a price." His fingers lingered on the bowl, as if reluctant to let it go. That night, I followed Tom's instructions. The whispers were deafening as I walked into the field, no longer trying to sound like words, just the hungry noise of something ancient and patient. The stalks closed in around me like walls in a maze, their shadows writhing in the beam of my flashlight. When I reached the center, I placed the bowl on the ground, my hands shaking as I poured in the herbs. The match flared unnaturally bright in the darkness as I lit them. The smoke spiraled upward in patterns that hurt my eyes, and I whispered the name, Tehisha. The shadows emerged immediately, surrounding me in a perfect circle. Their hollow eyes burned with an intensity that stripped away all pretense of humanity. They moved closer, their forms rippling like heat waves over hot asphalt. One of them reached out, its hand brushing against my chest. A searing pain shot through me, as if something essential was being carved out of my soul, and I fell to my knees in the too black soil. "What do you want?" I gasped, though I knew they wouldn't answer in any way I could understand. The shadows didn't speak. Instead, they faded into the smoke, leaving me alone in the darkness. But I wasn't really alone. I would never be alone again. The field has been quiet since that night. The whispers are gone, and the shadows no longer haunt my dreams. But the price they took, I'm not sure what it was. Not exactly. Sometimes I wake up with an ache in my chest, as if a vital organ has been removed, leaving only phantom pain behind. And Sarah says I've changed, that I'm colder, more distant. The children cry when I hold them now. I haven't told her about the burn mark on my chest, shaped like a handprint that's too long, too thin to be human. I haven't mentioned how the soil in the field has turned black as pitch, how nothing grows there now except strange, pale mushrooms that appear and disappear with the moon. I don't know if I'll ever plant anything there again. Some doors, once opened, change both sides of the threshold. Tom Greyfeather was right. The field wasn't just land. It was a boundary, a door to something we're not meant to understand. And once you open that door, it never truly closes. The knowledge sits in my chest like a stone, heavy with the weight of generations of wisdom ignored. I still see the crows sometimes, perched along the fence, watching in silence. Their eyes hold a different light now, recognition, perhaps, or pity. They know the truth, even if I try to forget it. The shadows are still there, waiting, just out of sight, and I know they'll come for me again someday. In my more lucid moments, I wonder if that's what they wanted all along. Not just an offering, but a witness. Someone to carry their story forward, to warn others away from doors best left closed. But who would believe me? Who would understand that sometimes a gift is really a curse? That some boundaries exist for a reason? That the darkest shadows are cast by the brightest dreams? So I keep my silence, tend my failing marriage, and try not to notice how my reflection grows a little less substantial each day, how my own shadow sometimes moves without me, reaching for something I can no longer see. The land was a gift, or so I thought. Now I know better. It was never a gift at all. It was a test, and I failed it. And somewhere in that field, in the space between what is and what should not be, the shadows are dancing, waiting for the next dreamer who thinks he knows better than generations of wisdom. They are patient. They have all the time in the world. After all, some harvests take longer to gather than others. It started as an innocent camping trip, a chance to escape the monotony of daily life. The crushing weight of endless Zoom meetings, deadline pressures, and artificial office lighting had been wearing us down for months. My friends and I had been planning it for weeks. 3 days in the Great Lakes wilderness, hiking, fishing, and enjoying the peace that only comes from being miles away from civilization. We craved that disconnection, that primal return to nature. Looking back now, I realize how naive we were, how little we understood about the true meaning of primal. There were 5 of us. Me, Matt, Sarah, Jason, and Claire. We'd been friends since college, bound together by late-night study sessions and shared dreams that seemed so distant now. This trip was supposed to be a reunion of sorts, a way to recapture the closeness we'd lost to careers and relationships and the general drift of adult life. Matt had suggested the location, a remote area with a series of trails known for its stunning views and pristine lakes. He'd found it on some obscure hiking forum, users raving about its untouched beauty. The trailhead was marked on our map, but when we arrived, we found something unusual. An old wooden marker next to the official sign, carved with strange symbols. The wood was weathered, dark with age and exposure, and the carvings looked like claw marks, deep gouges that spoke of something more violent than mere artistic expression. "That's creepy," Sarah said, eyeing the marker. Her fingers clutched the strap of her backpack, knuckles white against the fabric. I noticed how she kept her distance from the wooden post, as if afraid it might reach out and grab her. "Probably just an art project," Matt replied, dismissing it with a shrug that seemed a little too forced. "Come on, we've got miles to cover before dark." His voice carried that familiar, authoritative tone from our college days. when he'd always been the one to rally us for late-night food runs or impromptu road trips. We set off down the trail, joking and laughing as the sun filtered through the dense canopy above, creating shifting patterns on the leaf-strewn ground. The air was crisp, the kind of freshness you only find in the wilderness, carrying the complex bouquet of pine needles, damp earth, and something else, something older and less definable. But as we walked, an odd feeling settled over me, like the forest was watching us. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers, and shadows moved in ways that didn't quite match the wind's pattern. I tried to shake it off. This was supposed to be fun, a break from paranoid thoughts and anxiety, not a chance to indulge them. The first day passed without incident, though looking back, there were signs we should have noticed. The birdsong that grew increasingly sparse as we ventured deeper into the woods. The way small animals would freeze and scatter at our approach, their fear palpable in the still air. We hiked about 6 miles, our packs growing heavier with each step, until we found a perfect campsite near a crystal-clear lake. The water was mirror smooth, reflecting the darkening sky with an almost unnatural perfection. We spent the evening cooking over a campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows on our faces as we shared stories and memories. Jason pulled out his guitar, its gentle acoustics echoing oddly in the dense forest, and Claire told ghost stories, tales of wanderers lost in these very woods, of strange lights and unexplained disappearances. At the time, we laughed them off as campfire fiction. Now, I wonder if she had somehow sensed what was coming. But that night, I woke to the sound of something moving outside my tent. The nylon walls suddenly seemed absurdly thin, offering no real protection from whatever lurked in the darkness. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But then I heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to originate from something far larger than any normal forest creature. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against wood, a slow, deliberate sound that spoke of intelligence and purpose. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, each beat a thunder in my ears as I lay frozen, straining to hear more. The sleeping bag felt like a straitjacket, and sweat began to soak through my clothes despite the cool night air. The noise stopped abruptly, and the forest fell silent. Too silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets. Just an oppressive, unnatural quiet that pressed against my ears like a physical force. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, watching shadows move across my tent wall and wondering if they belonged to branches or to something else entirely. The next morning I told the others what I'd heard. The early sun did little to dispel the lingering unease of the night, and dark circles under everyone's eyes suggested I wasn't the only one who'd had trouble sleeping. Probably just a bear, Matt said, though his tone lacked conviction. He was trying to maintain his role as the group's voice of reason, but I could see the doubt in his eyes as they darted between the trees. Bears don't growl like that, I replied, remembering the otherworldly quality of the sound. And what about the scraping? It was deliberate, like it was leaving a message. Sarah looked uneasy, her usual confident demeanor cracking slightly. Maybe we should head back. Better safe than sorry, right? She was fiddling with her compass, which I noticed seemed to be spinning erratically despite her steady hands. Come on, Matt said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. We've come all this way. Let's just stick to the plan. Safety in numbers, right? His forced optimism felt hollow, like a mask that was starting to slip. Reluctantly, we packed up and continued along the trail, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically from the previous day. The forest felt darker, the air heavier, as if the very atmosphere was becoming more dense and oppressive. The trees seemed closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out more of the sky. We spoke less, our previous easy conversation replaced by nervous glances and hurried steps. Every snapping twig made us jump, and the shadows between the trees seemed to move independently of their sources. That afternoon, we came across another marker. This one was larger, its carvings deeper and more elaborate than the first. The symbols seemed to pulse in the sunlight, almost as if they were alive, writhing and shifting when viewed from the corner of your eye. They appeared to be some kind of ancient script, but unlike anything I'd ever seen in history books or documentaries. Looking at them directly made my head hurt, as if my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. "What is this?" Claire asked, reaching out to touch it. Her voice had taken on a dreamy quality that sent alarms ringing through my mind. "Don't," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She pulled her hand back as if burned, and we moved on. But the sense of unease only grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just avoided something terrible, like a trap that had barely failed to spring. By the second night, we were all on edge. The fire crackled weakly, barely warding off the encroaching darkness that seemed thicker and more tangible than any natural night. Jason tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but no one laughed. The sound fell flat in the dense air, like the forest itself was swallowing our voices. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered suddenly, her eyes wide with fear. Her hand clutched my arm with bruising force. We all froze, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, we heard it, a distant, mournful wail, like the cry of an injured animal, but wrong somehow. It carried notes that no earthly creature should be able to produce, harmonics that set my teeth on edge and made my stomach churn. It sent chills down my spine and raised goosebumps on my arms. "Probably just the wind," Matt said, though his voice was shaky and thin. He was still trying to be the rational one, but I could see his hands trembling as he poked at the fire. But it wasn't the wind. The wail came again, louder this time, closer. It was joined by another sound, heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush, each step deliberate and measured. Whatever was out there, it was big, far bigger than any normal forest predator. The sound had a weight to it, and presence that seemed to distort the air. "Everyone into the tents," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even as panic clawed at my throat. "Now." We doused the fire and huddled in our tents, clutching knives and pepper spray, pathetically inadequate weapons against whatever was stalking us. The footsteps circled our campsite, slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the fear of its prey. I held my breath, praying it would pass, trying not to think about how thin the tent fabric was, how easily it could be torn apart. The footsteps grew closer, and I could hear something else now. A wet, clicking sound, like something smacking its lips. The air grew cold, so cold that our breath came out in visible puffs even inside the tent. Eventually the sounds faded, and we dared to exhale, but none of us slept. How could we, knowing what waited in the darkness? The next morning, we found claw marks on the trees surrounding our campsite, deep, jagged grooves that couldn't have been made by any animal I knew. They were too high up, too precisely placed, forming patterns that almost looked like words in some alien language. The bark around the marks was blackened, as if burned by acid. Jason wanted to leave immediately, his usual bravado completely gone. "We've only got one day left," Matt argued, though his face was ashen. "We can't just quit now." His words sounded hollow, like he was reading from a script he no longer believed in. "Something's out there," I said, voicing what we all knew but had been afraid to acknowledge. "Something that's been following us since we started. Those markers weren't art. They were warnings." "Come on, it's probably just a bear," Matt said again, though even he didn't seem to believe it. His eyes kept darting to the claw marks, measuring their height against his own. Against my better judgment, we pressed on. But the trail seemed different now, twisted somehow. The landmarks on the map didn't match what we saw, and the path twisted and turned in ways it shouldn't have. Trees we passed seemed to reappear ahead of us, and clearings we'd crossed through somehow ended up behind us again. It was as if the forest itself was changing, leading us deeper into its heart, like a spider manipulating its web. By late afternoon, we were hopelessly lost. The sun was low, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own, reaching toward us with dark fingers. Claire tripped over something, and when I bent down to help her, I saw what it was. A pile of bones, picked clean and arranged in a deliberate pattern. Human bones. Some still had scraps of clothing clinging to them, and a rusted watch hung from one wrist. Its face cracked and stopped at midnight. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. "Which way?" Jason asked, spinning in place. "Every path looks the same." The trees had closed in around us, creating a maze of identical trunks and shadows. The wailing started again, louder and more frantic. It seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the trees until it was impossible to tell its source. We ran, panic driving us deeper into the forest. The shadows grew thicker, coalescing into shapes that moved and darted between the trees. Faces seemed to form in the bark, twisted in expressions of agony. I didn't realize we'd split up until I stopped to catch my breath, my lungs burning with the frigid air. Jason and Claire were gone, and only Sarah and Matt were with me. The forest had somehow separated us, herding us like cattle to slaughter. "We have to find them," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. Her voice was hoarse from screaming their names. "We need to find a way out first," Matt said, his face pale and drawn. "We can't help them if we're lost too." His practical nature was asserting itself, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. Night fell quickly, unnaturally so, and we were forced to stop. The wails had subsided, replaced by a deep, guttural growling that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath our feet. We huddled together, weapons in hand, as the forest closed in around us. The darkness felt alive, pulsing with malevolent intelligence. That's when we saw it. A towering figure emerged from the shadows, its emaciated frame wrapped in tattered flesh that hung from its bones like rotting cloth. Its limbs were too long, too jointed, bending in ways that defied anatomy. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, pits of ancient hunger that seemed to draw in light itself, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth that gleamed wetly in the darkness. The Wendigo. The stories I'd heard as a child came rushing back, a spirit of insatiable hunger, cursed to wander the wilderness, feeding on those who trespass in its domain. But no story could have prepared me for the reality of it, the overwhelming sense of age and evil that radiated from its twisted form. It moved within human speed, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. The air grew colder with each pass, until frost formed on our clothes and hair. Matt lunged at it with a knife, a desperate act of bravery, but the creature swatted him aside like he was nothing more than an annoying insect. Sarah screamed as it turned its hollow eyes on her, her voice cutting off abruptly, as if stolen by the creature's gaze. I grabbed a burning branch from our makeshift fire, acting on instinct rather than thought. The flames seemed to repel it, and it let out a bone-chilling screech before retreating into the darkness. The sound was like metal scraping against metal, like 1,000 voices crying out in pain. We didn't sleep that night. How could we, knowing what lurked in the darkness? At dawn, we found Jason's backpack, torn and bloodied, but no sign of him or Claire. The fabric was shredded by claws, and strange symbols had been carved into the metal frame. We stumbled through the forest, following the rising sun, until we finally broke through the tree line and onto a road. The transition was jarring. One moment we were in that nightmare realm, and the next, we were back in the world of asphalt and power lines. A passing car stopped to help us, and we told the driver we'd gotten lost. We didn't mention the Wendigo. Who would believe us? How could we explain what we'd seen, what we'd experienced? The driver commented on our appearances, the frost in our hair despite the warm day, the strange symbols that seemed to have been burned into our skin when the creature passed near us. It's been weeks since the trip, but I can't shake the feeling that we're still being watched. The Wendigo marked us that day, and I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for us again. Matt and Sarah have stopped responding to my calls, and when I drive by their houses, they're dark and empty. I've started hearing faint wails at night, even in the safety of my own home. Sometimes, in mirrors or windows, I catch glimpses of yellow eyes watching me, gone when I turn to look directly. The forest never lets you go. Not really. Its darkness seeps into your bones, becomes part of you. And the Wendigo is always hungry, always patient, always waiting. I know now why those markers were there. Not as warnings to stay away, but as markers of the Wendigo's hunting ground. We were never meant to leave those woods, and soon, I fear, we won't. The hunger is growing stronger every day.